to meet those that we've been a-missing and haven't got there yet. Well, tonight we're going to continue on with our series that we just began last week in 1 Samuel. This is our second in this series, so you'll see 1 Samuel 1, 1 Samuel 2, and 1 Samuel 3, and so on until we get through the book. We mentioned to you about the three characters, the primary characters in the book. And they are, of course, Samuel, Saul, and David. And you can see the chapters that I've divided them in. And this is pretty much common division with most, but not all, but it's pretty common. Chapters 1 through 8 deal with Samuel. Chapters 9 through 15 with Saul. And then David, chapters 16 through 31. Though we do not actually see the birth of either Saul or David, we see their arrival on the scene. Saul as a young man and David as a young man. Samuel, of course, will see his birth and his death as well as his life. Saul, we also will see his death in this particular book. So when we begin to look through this section, or each section, you know, though we've got it Samuel, Saul, and David, just realize that they're not the only characters. And it sometimes doesn't feel like they're the main characters because there's some other prominent parts of the story that have to take place to introduce these characters. But to remind you, Samuel is going to be one of the great prophets of Israel and well beloved. It's also, though, in this particular time where you'll not only see about these people, but you'll learn about the nation of Israel and what's been happening with them, to them, and also this is during a time of the rise of the Philistines. It's also an expansion of their aggression and their attack. It's also a time of rebellion in the nation of Israel. They're not a real spiritual group of people. In fact, idolatry is pretty much rampant. True worship is often neglected, and selfishness reigns supreme. Selfishness, well, that's going to really destroy any nation. In fact, as we close, this is not the only verse that's in the book of Judges. It's in there twice, but as the book closes, after we learn about Samuel and his birth, one of the things that we can see, well, now see, I'm getting into my outline before I ever get there, and I forgot about that, so I need to give you that. I should go back and at least remind you of where his birth is. Wherefore, again, it came to pass when time was come, about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I've asked of the Lord. But we're going to get more into that. Now, I'm dividing his particular life, there we go, in three sections also. These are kind of arbitrary divisions, but again, you'll read a lot of commentators divide in the same way. So preparing for Samuel, chapter 1 through chapter 4. And then also in chapter 4, you begin the story of the national crisis, which in that national crisis, it really does cover a lot about Eli and the Philistines and the Ark of the Covenant. And in the last is Samuel's judgeship. A lot of people forget that he was judge of Israel. He was the last judge of Israel, and he judged Israel for 20 years. We'll see that as we get through it. We're not going to even get out of the first section tonight. In fact, we'll barely get out of the first chapter tonight, if we do at all get out of the first chapter. Now, where I was rushing to was this particular verse because of what's happening with Israel, and to give you the kind of the characteristics, the attitude of Israel, which is, what does it say? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Well, they had God. They had a theocracy. So it isn't because they didn't have a king, but that's what they're clamoring and saying, and that's their excuse. We don't have a king. So what? Since we got no boss, I'm in charge. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's sad when you get to that point. But doesn't it feel kind of like we're in that point in our own country? That everyone is doing that which is right in their own eyes. They have an opinion, and their opinion is the best opinion. And you can't tell people about the facts, especially about the Bible. They don't want to hear any of that. There is a nation of believers that are dying. They're going by the wayside. And that's sad. We're going to look first a little bit at Samuel's heritage. One of the things that you'll notice was, that you will notice, and I should have taken a little break at showing that particular verse yet, but Elkanah, that's Samuel's dad, was of the priestly tribe of the Levites, and in particular of the family of the Kohathites. Now, if you remember, that means his lineage then came through Korah. If you remember Korah, he was a rebellious one that fought against the chosen priesthood. He didn't like it. Who appointed you priest? How come Aaron gets to be the one? I think I ought to be it. No, he said, okay, well, you bring your family on. And so it was not just him, but it was also Dothan, another fella. And he said, bring your censers. And whichever one is left standing is the one that God has chosen. And they were all killed. In fact, you probably remember the earth swallowed them up, and they were no more. But I have that verse up there because you think first off, well, if Korah and his family were all killed, how is it that he could have his heritage as being from him? Because notwithstanding the children of Korah died not. Not everybody out of Korah's family aligned themselves with Korah. So while a lot of them died, not all of them did. Elsewhere, of course, we read of others, though, again, part of his family, they did not stand with him in rebellion against God's chosen leadership. We also learn that Elkanah lived and raised his family in Ramah. It is said that he was, and I think it's true when we read after him, though we don't find these descriptive words, I can see that I think he was a faithful, a loving, and a compassionate husband. That's what you learn about this man. The place of worship at this particular time was not in Jerusalem, but it was in Shiloh. And if you remember, this had been set up during the Joshua's time, where it says after they had crossed the Jordan River, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there, and the land was subdued before them. So while this is the time and the era, Shiloh was the place of worship. So when you read that, know that's what's going on. In fact, Shiloh was the place where the land was divided, the inheritance was handed out. And in fact, it's mentioned that there were 7 of the tribes that originally hadn't been given their inheritance, and it was at Shiloh that they were given that inheritance. In making a practical application of just this little section here, I can see something about the fact of Samuel's heritage. Think about this. He was one of God's greatest prophets, not an Elijah or an Elisha, but pretty close. Samuel, though he was a godly man, came from an ungodly heritage. Well, didn't you? We all came from sinners. That's what it is. We're not coming from a perfect heritage. And when you begin to think of that, we can look and see that this is a man that is going to be used as the catalyst to change Israel. That's what's going to happen. So the history of where he came from, it was negative, but it didn't matter. That's not what qualified him or unqualified him. God providentially and purposely shows us this theme time and time again. Royalty or riches among men does not guarantee excludes you from the riches of God's grace. God chooses and uses whosoever he will. This is not a fictional story. This is not a mythical story. It is a literal story about a literal family. And God, in his infinite wisdom, power, holiness, and justice, can always overrule man's purpose when and wherever he can. People will say oftentimes, well, they came from a bad family. They were taught bad things. None of that dictates who you have to be. Find out who you are from God. Find out who you can be from God. There are the possibilities. Next, I want to look at worship and wickedness. Here we have just a small comment at the end of this verse, but look at what it says. And this man, talking about Elkanah, went up out of his city, that's Ramah, yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And then you have this almost little parenthetical statement. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. That's about it. They were there. When I say worship and wickedness, I'm talking about the worship that Elkanah was giving to God and the wickedness that's represented by two priests that were there serving. But if you'll read, and we'll see that much later, these men did not know God. We're also in this particular portion introduced to two women. Peninnah, who had several children, both sons and daughters, and the other Hannah, who we've already learned was barren, but was dearly loved by her husband. Peninnah agitated and irritated Hannah anytime she could. Hannah did not turn around and treat the other wife the same way. She was quiet about that. Of course, again, we're introduced to this priestly family, the sons of Eli, and we'll learn that these are wicked men who literally abused their office. They were morally bankrupt. That's what they were. In contrast, we find Elkanah was a faithful and consistent believer who, again, went up yearly. Now, we say that because this is prescribed by law. All males were to appear before the Lord 3 times a year in Deuteronomy 16. And verse 16, it says, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of the unleavened bread, and in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles. Notice the 3 that are there. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Don't you come empty-handed. You bring your offering. You bring your sacrifice. There were times where, again, they needed to bring a burnt offering, a sin offering, and a peace offering. These were the things that they did. Now, the contrast will become even more obvious when we see the generosity of this husband, Elkanah, and the contrast when you see the selfishness of those 2 sons. Selfish priests who sought to please themselves, Elkanah sought to please God. So that's a pretty good heritage too when we can look at that. Now, Elkanah, it says, gave portions. Possibly, it's included that it could have been garments for these occasions. Just like when we go to some special occasion, what do? We dress up a little bit more. This was an occasion to where no doubt they would dress appropriately, for the services that they went along. But included in that, of course, is the portion of the offering which they were allowed to eat as the feast, as part of the feast. In fact, if you gave your offering family. And 2, we learned that this part of it all, when we look at that, in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 6, it says, and her adversary, and we looked at this last week, talking about Peninnah and Hannah, her adversary also provoked her sore. Why? For to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. That's really cold. That's wicked. That's just horrible. Well, it also will show something there, I think, because of this particular, what the Lord had done, is the reason why Elkanah cared for her so much. He loved her. He poured more out upon her. Not just because she didn't have children, but because he loved her and was sympathetic and compassionate. Again, all that Peninnah did was to make her rival fret. She was purposely trying to agitate and irritate. Sometimes that's the best that people can do for somebody else, is irritate you and agitate you. She used that irritation and agitation, but Hannah did not reciprocate. Hannah took her problem to the Lord. What does that tell us we ought to do? Instead of reciprocating, which is really what we want to do, don't. Take it to the Lord. We look at chapter 1 and verse 10. It says, and she was in bitterness of soul. But she didn't bark. That's usually my way, barking back. What did she do? She prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. Little did Hannah know that her bitterness of soul would actually be the beginning of her prayer that would be the reason for her getting the gift of Samuel. And in fact, little did she know that her bitterness of soul was the reason why she would make that vow, and to her would then be born one of the great prophets of God. In fact, let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11 right after that, where it says, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid and remember me. Pay attention to that, and remember me. Because a little bit later you're going to see where the Lord remembered her. Her prayer was answered. This is something that ought to encourage us. Her prayer was answered. Her prayer that found its origin in the bitterness of her soul. And when she wept sore, her prayer was answered. But she said, look on the affliction of thine handmaid and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man child. If you'll do this, God, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Most of us understand that as the Nazirite vow. And I think we can draw from this whole story of Elkanah and of Hannah and his great love for her, that too we should be able to figure out that Elkanah, she didn't do this by herself. I mean, she made the vow by herself, but what if you know anything about the law, and if you know anything about what the Bible says in the Old Testament, when a woman that's married makes a vow, or when a daughter makes a vow, both the husband or the father can annul the vow. Elkanah did not do that. Elkanah agreed and in fact encouraged her later. You remember that vow. You remember what the Lord said and what the Lord promised. So I think it shows that he confirmed her vow. He agreed with her, and they had prayed about it together. So in Numbers 30 and verse 8, I don't have that verse up there on the screen, but you can look it up again, that they could have voided the whole thing, but he did not do it. So what practical application can we make of this little portion of the story? Well, again, that she did not return to her other wife what was given to her. She brought her bitterness of soul to the Lord. She sought relief from the only one who could give relief. When you have someone that's bothering you for something they really have no control over, they didn't do it, go to the one who has control over it. And you'll see later, well, we won't get into it tonight. We won't be able to get that far. When she prays her prayer, she's ready to, Lord, give it to him now. But that's the way she prays. She found trouble and agitation. Just like you and I, it may not be another person, but we may get agitation and irritation from ourselves. You ever fought with yourself? I have. The old flesh fights with my spirit all the time. You know, that's why Galatians talks about the spirit and the flesh. They're contrary to one another. They fight with one another. Rather than fight back in the flesh, we need to realize that our fight is not against flesh and blood. And I'm sure that Hannah's passion equaled, she wanted a baby. Do you remember Rachel? In Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1 it says, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. Man, that's pretty strong. I think the passion was equal. But Hannah did not go to her husband. She went to the Lord. And she asked the Lord to open up her womb, and he in fact did. Now from that, when we go into chapter 2, well, we're not going to get into there just yet, but in chapter 1, verse 12, we'll start there where we're talking about confusion and calm. The reason why I've said that, because here we have this confusion, this weeping, and this bitterness, but we have also the confusion not only from her, but from Eli, the high priest. It says that she's over there praying in verse 12, and it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. Now, why would you do that? Why were you looking? Because she's over there and it's probably looking like she's going to town. She's all emotional, but there's not a sound coming out of her mouth. But she's moving her mouth. Well, Eli, and noticing this as she was praying, he thought that she was drunk. You're acting like a drunk woman. She defends herself and reveals her sorrowing spirit, and that this is a deep depression, and she expresses that in her words. Well, once she explains this to Eli, in verse 17, notice what Eli says. Then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Was he prophetic at that time? Indeed he was. Did he get that word from the Lord, or did the Lord just put the words in his mouth? I think the Lord put the words in his mouth. Whatever it was, whether God had revealed the answer to her petition or to Eli, or gave Eli the confidence to say these words, they were true words. And she could go home in peace. And guess what? She did go home in peace. Verse 18, and she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. Isn't that rich? Isn't that wonderful? She had the confidence that her prayer was going to be answered. Eli's word lifted Hannah's spirit and made her smile. She believed. She went home. And you know what happened? The Lord remembered her. Verse 20, wherefore it came to pass when the time was come after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because she knew why she had Samuel, because I have asked him of the Lord. She knew this was an answered prayer, not after he was born, but even before he was born. She had asked him of the Lord. Now, from there, just to go right into the very next verse and look at Samuel given to the Lord. Now, before we get there, we have a little bit of the story again to be able to look at. But in verse 1, and the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord. Notice that last phrase, and there abide forever. Give up your child to serve the Lord forever, never to return home again. And we'll see he was not a young man, he was a young boy. That's quite a bit. But Elkanah, I think, agreed with Hannah's purpose and plan. All right, you stay home. I think he also said some things that help us again discover more fully this child of grace and his purpose in his life. In verse 23 says, And Elkanah her husband said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good. Now a lot of times, gentlemen, there's some wisdom right there. Your wife has been praying, she's spiritual, listen to her. What does he say? You do what seemeth to thee good. But he does say, tarry until thou have weaned him. Only the Lord established his word. In other words, we already know what God's going to do and what you have to do. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she had weaned him. They both believed that the Lord had given them, I believe, clarity about her vow and God's acceptance on this agreement. And that Samuel would appear before the Lord and he would abide there until his death. In fact, I believe he would appear before the Lord and abide with him forever is accurate. He's not going to appear before the Lord forever in the flesh, but once he died, he appeared before the Lord and he is with the Lord even now. So he is with the Lord forever. The idea of weaning a child is quite interesting here. But it should be obvious that it really is not just until he went from feeding from his mother until he could be fed common food. In fact, many think it's possible that he could have been as old as 9 or 10. Others think that it was probably about 5 years old. He had to be of an age where I don't think that Eli was going to be involved in changing diapers and feeding him from a high chair. So I think he was capable of taking care of himself to a great degree without assistance, feeding himself, cleaning himself, and restroom uses. Others say that it was a time in which a child was able to care for himself and to begin learning. Well, that would really fit our age and understanding of when we have children beginning their education, usually about 5 years old. If you read Isaiah 28 and verse 9, it says, Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. There is a point in time where a child can begin to learn. Not just learn how to hold a spoon, not just learn how to use a restroom, but learn how to learn and sit and learn from the Word. Precept, that verse right after that says precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. When you've got a child at that age, that's when they're weaned. Practical applications from this are many. From this, you and I can see how necessary it is for both the husband and the wife to agree and to be in union on the way and the manner of raising children. We never hear about Eli's wife. He had to have one to have 2 sons, but he had wicked sons. I don't know if it was Eli because he didn't discipline or what the problem there was in total. But listen, it is important that husbands and wives agree on the way and the manner of raising their children and raising them up in the nurture of the Lord. They both agreed and they both knew that this day would someday come when they would bring him to Eli and leave him there. Elkanah probably saw Hannah's hesitation about that day. I mean, who wouldn't? I think that even when we have children that have moved all the way to Nebraska, we still want them to be right here. We love them no matter where they are, where they go. And it's hard to say goodbye. And we look forward to the next time that we can see them again. So I think that though Hannah may have been a little bit hesitant, that Elkanah was just encouraging her. Remember, we're going to fulfill the word of the Lord. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a reminder and an encouragement of their vow together and how they believed that God had answered them. But I don't think they knew how great the answer was, that Samuel would be the one to change the spirit of Israel. It also speaks about how this father kept his habit of worship and the travel, though his wife and son would not be going with him. Excuse me for saying this, but there's a lot of times when I see a family and there might be a child that's sick and both parents stay home when only one is required to care for them. My opinion. That's all it is. But I'm going to say that. That comes from a preacher's kid who, when I claimed to be sick, I was just told to grab a blanket and a pillow and you can lay in the back pew. But it's important. He didn't stop because Hannah didn't go. He didn't stop because his child wasn't going to go. He went. Every year he was faithful to his vow. It also speaks how that caring for a child can give cause to interrupt the mother's worship or the family's worship without it being considered a sin. It's not considered a sin that she stayed home to wean the child. There's not a problem there. You follow the Lord's leading, but none of this removes the personal and parental responsibility to train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. But this was a special child. Once the child was weaned, of course, we know she took him to Shiloh. She was prepared to offer a peace offering, a sin offering, and a burnt offering, and a drink offering. You can go through and look at the bullocks that she brought, 3 of them. You can see where she brought the wine, again, for a drink offering. It speaks of trusting the Lord because he brought this child, her sweet, precious child. Who did she bring him to? Eli. What kind of father was Eli? Now I'm going to give my child to this man who couldn't raise 2 sons, and they're wicked. They knew about Hophni and Phinehas. What does it speak of? That she was trusting in the Lord. I wouldn't want Eli to raise my son. I don't think any of you would either. But it also gives evidence that both mom and dad taught him about God's grace and plan for his life. And in verse 28 of chapter 1, back to 1 Samuel, it says, therefore, also I have lent him to the Lord. As long, I kind of like that. I lent him to the Lord. Well, for how long? Because lending sounds like it's just for a while. But look what she says. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. There's a lot of conversation and commentaries about that last sentence, and he worshiped the Lord there. Who's the he? I think it's Samuel. I think he was already taught about worshiping the Lord. I think that he is Samuel, and he was prepared to serve and worship the Lord. He wasn't forced. He wasn't brainwashed. He was taught and believed in the grace of God. Now, I will only just mention this because I don't have enough time to get into it, but Hannah's prayer. I only give you the first couple of verses because it kind of changes its tone and tenor after this. But in Hannah's prayer, and this is where we'll pick back up next week, Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. When she's bringing Samuel there to Eli, there is no hesitation. There is no question, because she's not trusting Eli. She's trusting God. And she knows that God has his hand on her son. Let me just mention a couple of things about this if you want to go in and look at it, because you'll find that it's a humble prayer. You'll find it's a prayer of supplication. You'll also find that it's a prayer of rebuke to those who had afflicted her, and it's a prayer of praise for the other children that she was blessed with besides Samuel. In fact, there's a little dispute because it talks about in her prayer 7 children. Then we learn later on there's 5 besides Samuel that she was given. I don't know if one was died after birth or what happened. There's a different number. Some will say that 7 just is the perfect number. God is going to bless me with a perfect number of children, whatever I'm supposed to have. That she didn't just get Samuel. It is a prayer recognizing the sovereign grace and power of God, and how that she was given to believe that God would use Samuel to restore her nation and their love for the Lord their God. We'll see that in her prayer as we look into chapter 2 next week. I pray that's been a blessing to you and encouragement as we continue our study through the book of 1 Samuel. And with that, we'll go ahead and take your